Hi folks, so we're going to continue our discussion of research methods, but this time centered around the Stanford prison experiment. Last time we had left off talking about some of the key terminology that's used in social research methods, and we were talking about concepts, variables, and then how to operationalize those variables. So say for instance you want to study the concept of immigrant identity, immigrant acculturation. You would have to look at variables like immigrant political participation, economic assimilation, and things of that nature, right? And then finally, you would operationalize that by looking at things like their voting behavior, their wealth and income, and things of that nature. So in research methods, we sometimes call it sending something down the conceptual funnel. You start with something abstract and you get it down to something that's very tangible and measurable. Now, in any science, you have to understand the relations between variables. You have independent and dependent variables. The independent variable causes changes in the dependent variable. So for instance, levels of education may be the independent variable, and that has an impact on the variable of support for same-sex marriage. And we find in research that higher the levels of education, greater the support for same-sex marriage. So essentially, we are talking about a causal link between two variables, where the independent variable is causing changes in the dependent variable. For causality to be established, your first requirement would be correlation. But correlation is not sufficient. Correlation is simply one of the conditions for causality to happen. When two variables are correlated, it simply means that they are changing together. When one variable is going up, the other one's going up. That's a direct correlation. It could also be that when one variable is going up, the other is going down, which is an inverse correlation. So an example of inverse correlation might be as levels of education go up, levels of religiosity go down, right? But as I said, you need two other conditions to establish a causal connection between two variables. The second condition would be time order, which is the independent variable needs to have occurred before the dependent variable. This is not always obvious. So for instance, does homelessness cause depression, or does depression cause homelessness? We don't know. Either seems equally likely. It's something that needs to be researched empirically. The third condition would be that there are no other factors that could have caused the observed result. Sometimes we also call this the lack of a third variable or lack of a spurious relationship, right? Now we can see examples of that. So for instance, we see a strong correlation between eating ice cream and drowning. And so folks often wonder, like, what's going on? Is the ice cream spiked with something? And the answer there is that there's a third variable involved, which is summertime. So more folks eat ice cream during summertime. More folks go out swimming during summertime. And that's why you see that both are very strongly correlated. It's not that eating ice cream is causing you to drown, but essentially summer is causing both. You have another example of this. you see a strong correlation between passport ownership and the prevalence of diabetes. In other words, the higher the number of people who own passports, the lower the prevalence of diabetes. And so, of course, you know intuitively that there must be something else going on here. And so, if you're guessing the third variable is social class, then you're right. The wealthier you are, the more likely you are to own a passport and more likely to travel. The wealthier you are, you're also less likely to have diabetes. So hopefully you get that relationship between how independent variables cause changes in the dependent variable only when they meet those three criteria for causality. So under our module on tools for social research, you will be linked to the Quiet Rage. The film Quiet Rage covers the infamous Stanford prison experiment where Professor Philip Zimbardo, who's a psychology professor, holds this simulation of a prison in the psychology building at Stanford, and essentially he has to put an end to the experiment before the 2 weeks planned, precisely because he starts seeing these changes pretty rapidly in how the participants occupy these roles that they really internalize. That same film, Quiet Rage, also talks about the Milgram experiment that happened a decade before the Stanford prison experiment. Let's just say that these experiments have been heavily critiqued in more recent years, and yet they're still often cited. And the purpose of looking at those experiments is not only to look at the very serious ethical concerns that exist of violating the human subjects, rules, etc., but also certain methodological concerns that exist, right? So for instance, Zimbardo himself plays the role of the prison superintendent, and he's also the one in charge of the experiment, and that's a big no-no. If you are participating in the experiment, you should not be in charge of overseeing the experiment. Some folks have also raised questions about the debriefing process, that folks who participated endure many years of trauma from participating in that experiment, that they were kind of duped into participating, and informed consent is a really important rule, methodological rule. And so it is safe to say that in 2020, these experiments would have never passed the Institutional Review Board. So anytime you're conducting experiments with human subjects or working with human subjects, you need to have IRB approval, which is the Institutional Review Board. And especially if you're working with vulnerable populations such as minors or mental health patients or prisoners or sex workers. And so it's something to be really mindful of as a researcher, and also understanding that we have power as researchers, right? And certain responsibilities towards our subjects. It is really important to discuss the implications of the Stanford prison experiment. You could also talk about the sampling that occurred, that we are looking at a group of, in many ways, privileged white male students who were paid a nominal sum. And it's our job as sociologists also to examine how that might have shaped the outcomes of the experiment. Would it have been different with women as respondents? Would it have been different with people of color, and so on? But there are some key findings from the experiment that Zimbardo asserts, and I'm hoping that in our discussion segment we can debate and discuss some of that, because the assertion he's making is that situational factors in fact overshadow personality factors. Or you could expand that analysis to say that situational factors activate certain aspects of our personality, right? So we find that indeed, given the circumstances, many of us are capable of deviant behavior that we don't usually expect from ourselves. As I mentioned, there are ethical issues. That is quite clear in the debrief interviews that happened several years later. You see that folks are still very much traumatized by their time in that simulated prison. You can think about the spurious relation. So is it really the circumstances, or is it the fact that we are talking about an entitled group of people who had never previously expected the loss of control? We can also think about how that changes our perspective on deviance. Deviance is not a handful of psychopaths or a few bad apples, but deviance is very much determined by the social context, right? Those in power can determine who is deviant versus not. And if we create institutions where one group has all the power and no accountability, abuse is bound to happen, right? So you can think about the applications of those insights, both thinking in terms of prison industrial complex, police brutality, our own behavior online if we are anonymous, how people behave in crowds when there's very little accountability. So there are several different applications of these ideas possible. So that pretty much concludes our introduction to research methods. Again, if you're interested in going deeper into learning the actual methodology, you would take Sociology 123, which is the research methods class. I hope you will if you become sociology majors. And in our next segment, we will turn towards sociological theory and just get introduced to some of the founding thinkers in our discipline. See you later.